Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be listening to the third part of What If Didn't Believe All Might and Remained Quirkless. If you enjoy, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing down below, and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you get notified when videos go live. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. Chapter 5, We just have form time in the UK to make friends. Not I sat next to you for our 3-hour orientation and now we're best friends. Midoriya Izuku, you are not leaving this house with your tie tied like that. Midoriya Inko yelled as Izuku went to leave the house. He looked down at the red stump of fabric. The end of the toe barely reached his third button down, everything else had been tucked in. When getting ready, it hadn't looked too bad. It was weird but not comparable to his younger style. That consisted only of All Might merchandise. It suited Izuku. There was nothing to do with the fact he had no clue how to tie a tie, and this was what the tutorial led him to. Izuku raised his hands as he headed out of the house. "Mom, please, I can't be late on the first day and the train leaves soon," he reasoned. Inko shook her head. She grabbed her son's wrists. "It leaves in 20 minutes, Izuku, it won't leave that early. Come here, we need to fix that tie," Inko said. She pulled Izuku closer to her and wiggled the tie in her hand. Then tugged it undone, the slithery fabric unraveled in an instant. Inko lifted his mop of hair up and tucked the tie under his collar. "Let's do this right today, then you can make a fool of yourself tomorrow," she stated and draped the tie over his shoulders. Then she crossed the wide end over the narrow end. Inko looped the wide end over the narrow end. She looped the wide end over again. Before, she pulled the wide end through the loop. Finally, Inko tightened the knot and stepped back to view the decent tie. She'd done it exactly as Izuku had. "What did you do differently?" Izuku asked as he mentally went over through what he had done. "I made the wide end longer instead of equal. It always ends in that mistake. Now get going, you were the one worried about being late earlier," Inko stated as she shooed Izuku out the door. Izuku didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his bag and ran out of the door. The train wouldn't be 15 minutes early, so past the first corner he slowed down. Izuku fumbled as he tried to remove his headphones and phone from his bag's front pocket. The pocket was filled with cotton and scrap paper he had collected throughout the years. His eyebrows furrowed as he searched again. Izuku's fingers scraped the plastic case and he pulled it out. His phone wasn't too fancy, but it had a few apps, one of which being Spotify. The app had existed through the dawn of Quirks and hadn't been updated for a long time since. The songs were good and never changed. Izuku also didn't have the care to keep up with the latest hits. He plugged his earphones by the time he arrived at the train station. One earbud hung out in case anyone tried to jump him while the other in his ear played Universe Cat Drowning. The precaution turned out to be a good move. "Midoriya." The boy in question turned his head around to see Eureka in front of him. She continued speaking. Now she had his attention. "I haven't seen you since I finished cleaning the beach. I got into the hero course. Can you believe it? You got in as well," she pointed out, poking his jacket. Izuku backed away unconsciously. "Well, I got into the general education course." Eureka stopped poking him and clapped her hands together. "That's amazing, Midoriya. I heard the Gen Ed test was harder than the hero courses. I struggled with that, not massively because I did quite well. I had doubts when I finished about whether I had done a good enough job." Izuku laughed. If anyone came out of any exam feeling so smug, they'd have to be Kiken. The exams were difficult. Eureka went to respond to Izuku's statement, probably something like "Who was Kiken?" She was cut off by the train pulling in. The carriages flew by the two as they headed to the start of the stop while they stood by the back. The screeches of the brakes drowned out Izuku's music. The doors slid open and the two walked on, minding the gap. The screeches had quietened. They waited for fellow students to clamber on with them. "Kiken must be overconfident," Eureka stated. She waved her hand across the table the two had taken a seat at. "I mean, who has a stick that far up their ass?" Midoriya would decline that. His face went bright red. The kindest girl he ever met insulted Kiken. His eyes widened and he clenched his jaw to stop it dropping. The words of choice shook him to the bone. Eureka had preciously always used formalities. She picked up on his shock and waved her hands. Sorry. I just stuck around with the builders a lot more when I got my exam results. I guess a few of their speaking habits were picked up," she explained. Izuku took a few seconds to process the information and get the blood away from his cheeks. He relaxed on the seat and nodded. That makes more sense, he said, and dropped the conversation. Despite spending 10 months on the beach together, the two had little to talk about as the train rocked. Izuku found both earbuds back in his ear against his better judgment. Eureka was resting her head in her hand while she peered out of the window. The train halted to a stop at every station and Izuku knew Kiken must have got on at some point. Two people had taken the seats beside them. The invitation to ignore the two already sitting there was accepted. Izuku didn't notice they were pressed beside him until he looked up at Eureka's call of, "According to my dad, you can see UA from here." His head snapped up that instant to try get a glimpse of his high school. Eureka hadn't been lying. As they drew closer to the station, the glistening walls of UA were visible if you knew where to look. He was able to spot the building without pressing his face against the glass. "It looks the same as it did before," he whispered. Eureka laughed at his excitement. "Of course it does. They couldn't rebuild it in a few months." "Well, actually, Cementos," Izuku started. He kept talking about him until the train pulled up with the announcement for UA High School. He pulled his rucksack over his shoulders and waved to Eureka before he jogged towards to the school. She called, "Wait up." But Izuku opted to ignore his friend in favor of getting a closer look for the second time. He would never get used to it. The school reflected the light of the sun as if it were a beacon of light instead of the place that churned them out. Eureka got to the school a few minutes after Midoriya. The freckled boy had vanished into the maze of corridors. He wouldn't be seen again by her until lunch. If either of them found their way, of course. Opening the door to 1C was like opening the gates of hell. Any of the excitement from being in the building had worn off. The massive door that met Izuku was another reminder of how small he was in this school. He had read up on what the general education course was like. Most of the kids there would be chummy. They would try and befriend him in an instant until anyone realized he was quirkless. Kids only ever came to UA for heroics, management, or support. Just to learn was never an option. Izuku was a stepping stone to every kid behind that door. He knew that, but the pit wouldn't go down. Izuku stood outside the 1C door shaking like a leaf. He had thought he had pulled the handle down, but his hand refused to pull down. It stayed stuck there. He took a deep breath in and a deep breath out. The doorknobs went down his second try. The room was loud. Everyone was screeching at the top of their lungs about their quirks and sharing their names. Evidently, they were trying to be heard over their peers. No one even noticed the handle being turned. Izuku slipped into the room, squatted down beside a purplenet. His head lay on the desk because he was either done with life, or trying to sleep. Izuku assumed it was the former, considering how rowdy their classmates were. He didn't say anything to the boy, instead opting to sit there and stare at the mess. Analyzing his classmates got him nowhere. It sounded and looked like 14 Kikens had been shoved into a room. Except with less explosions and pain in Izuku's direction. They were so rowdy. 3 kids in the corner were huddled around an emitter. Meanwhile, a mutant was swarmed with people yelling things like, "Look how cool his shell is." More kids slid in, except they embraced the chaos that came with having more classmates. The last 5 in, fitted like a glove. One of them joined the group with emitters, showing how she could create sparkles. Another joined those crowding the mutant. They didn't stroke his shell, instead doodling in a notebook the patterns on the tips of his nose. The noise was louder than the bell. Everyone was still wandering around and between the desks. Mike came in. Izuku hadn't missed the door opening, revealing his homeroom teacher. He had been vibrating in his seat when he saw the speakers and yellow hair. Despite how obnoxious it though, no one else seemed to notice it. "Can I get a yet?" Present Mix screamed into the abyss of noise. He drowned out any of the chatter going on. Students peered round like deers in headlights and scurried to the seats furthest from him. "That's good," Present Mike said. "I know your first day's exciting, but I'm already going to deafen you all. I'm sure the listeners who weren't talking would rather you don't destroy their ears as well." He flashed a thumbs up at the classroom, getting a chorus of "Yes, add yes, Mike Sensei." "Awesome. I'm going to do introductions after we've gone down for Nizu's orientation. You'll probably learn each other's names throughout it. We'll do it all when you come back though." He stood in front of the class waiting for an hand to be raised or for someone to shout out. He received nothing. "Alright then, listeners. We ought to get going then. Follow me." Present Mike walked away from his desk and back round the door. He hovered by it, waiting for everyone to pick up their bags. The boy beside Izuku didn't move. As the classroom emptied out, Izuku shook one of the arms he was resting on. "Psst, we need to get going," he whispered in his ear. The kid lifted his head up and rubbed his eyes. His vision must be coming back slowly. It took him a while to realize all his classmates had vanished. Present Mike looked at them, waiting for them to leave the room. The purplenet came to his senses quickly. He looked at Mike and asked, "I'm taking my bag." "Nope. We'll pick them up afterwards, seeing as the whole year's going to be in orientation. Now come on listeners, we're going to be late," Present Mike exclaimed. Izuku nodded and scurried out of the classroom with either speed walk of his life. At his heels was the purplenet, who seemed equally determined to not be late. They were at the first corner when they caught up with the lingering crowd. The halls weren't for the huddle of general education students and the hero course. Several people were being pushed back. Izuku could see teachers running to intervene, including Mike. Izuku held his hand out to prevent the purple-haired kid from getting elbowed in his git. When he was held back, he looked up from his feet and whispered, "Thanks for that." Izuku grinned, "My pleasure." "Wait. What for?" He looked at the purplenet. "Well, you stopped me sleeping through orientation and falling into a fist fight." He shrugged, "I guess that's the sort of thing you say thank you for." Izuku grinned, "Thank you, but I don't think that's a fist fight, and it's what anyone would do, isn't it? I mean, imagining sleeping through your orientation and not even knowing." "You don't have to thank me, it's nothing special." He tried to push the praise off, but his mouth wouldn't stop stretching upwards. The happiness that radiated off him refused to be buried under the guise that it was nothing. His friend smirked like he knew everything Izuku blabbered before was bullshit. He ignored the chuckled. "That doesn't seem like nothing," he said when Izuku didn't let his happiness falter. Izuku shrugged, "I'm just not used to thanks before. That's all. We should probably head up to the crowd. I think it's starting to go down now that 1A or 1B has gotten inside the hall," he said. The corridor had begun to slowly shrink in the students taking it up thanks to a few heroes stepping in. The pace might be equal to a snail's, but at least they weren't standing still like sitting ducks. It took a while before they had been gathered in the hall. Students took seats like the one Izuku heard the hero exam participants sat in. The seats went up flights of stairs, were around 5 stories. Every 5 stairs would be a new row. It had obviously been laid out to hold all the students who tried to enter the academy. The first few rows would be capable of holding the whole year. It turned out Izuku was right. 60 students squished onto 10th while split into their courses. Management and support had a spacious amount of room. The other class weren't squiggling up to them. He tried to strain his ears to hear why 1B hadn't shared a row with 1A. He didn't find out. Nizu hopped up to the microphone. He had reassured Vlad King that having one class missing was no need for concern. Vlad's protests were what gave the conversation away. The purplenet, was he friend? Izuku thought so. Nudged him to try and whisper what he thought the screeches meant. An animal's cough broke him away from Izuku. The beady eyes stared at the pair until flicking back to the microphone. He pulled out a note card and spoke into a microphone that was way tall for him. "Hello there, new students of UA." A few murmurs broke out at that, the excitement of actually being here itching up to them in that second. Nizu waited for them to quieten down before she continued. He didn't stare with his button eyes like he had when his friend spoke. Izuku assumed that had something to do with it just being the two of them. "I am sure you are very excited, but for now we need to go through the rules and the map of our school. These are all included in the UA manual if any one of you would consider buying it. Now, how about I get started?" Izuku grinned when the principal read the first rule. It was simple enough to follow. Nizu asked for any questions, and when nobody spoke up he moved on. Izuku listened for the first 50 rule. Most of his classmates also did / His concentration dipped when they got into the 60s. The rule sounded exactly the same as one of the ones in 30s. One person raised their hand. "Nizu-san, what was rule number 54 again?" they asked. Izuku filtered out the question and instead focused on the words. "God, I know why Shouta skips this every year." From his homeroom teacher. Izuku's eyes widened when he flipped round to try and work out who Shouta's class was. It took a second to piece together that Shouta had missed orientation with the hero class. Izuku had not dreamt anything from earlier. An hour in, a few people whispered and shared the boredom. Nizu ignored them. He went over the rules once more with no questions this time. There were no questions the previous time either. Then he brought up the map of the school. The purplenet's eyes had furrowed, and amongst the noise he said, "My eyes are tricking me. There is no way that is our school's layout." Izuku knew where he was coming from. 1C were at the very front. The words explaining which classroom were blurred from a point they were illegible. His friend gulped and squinted to try and get a better sight. There was no luck. Izuku watched as Nizu smiled in their struggles. "Now, obviously you might be struggling to grasp the full size and distance at this size. I'll zoom in the image in a few seconds. It is automated, so we only need to wait." The wait was non-existent. As if there was a button in his paw, the screen flickered to a better view to the ground floor. The hallways and entrance were easy to read. Doors to classrooms being diagonal lines. The words were readable at this point. Nizu announced, "Now once you have this memorized, you may head off for class. It will switch in 5 minutes to floor 2, so you don't need to worry." Before he hopped off the podium to go back to his desk overlooking the students. Once he had left the room, students began to natter amongst themselves. Izuku couldn't help but hear a hiss of, 5 minutes isn't nearly enough time. No, it wasn't. He too hurried back into the room. Most of the morning was spent trying to memorize the school's layout to no success. Finding the classroom had been a stretch only made possible by Izuku's memory. They took a few wrong turns. But they made it in the end. They crashed down and looked up to see a few of their classmates. Weaklings, they didn't even try. Izuku hadn't given up. Don't you even dare suggest he did. He realized memorizing the map was pointless. Nizu liked seeing students suffer, with the get-to-know-you test as a prime example. It was like him to watch who was foolish enough to stick around until they got kicked from the auditorium. Izuku did not want that shame, and his friend didn't deserve it either. He dragged the purplenet out from the room. Mike-sensei was thrumming his fingers against the table. He looked over the group before sighing at how many people had fallen for the animal's trap. The class continued to sit in silence. It didn't take a genius to know that it would take a while before the rest of the class have up. Sleep was the best time passer. Izuku didn't want to bury his hands and face into his desk. Sleeping on his first day would be impossible. His tired friend slumped his head back on the table. Mike seemed to be having the same problem. He glanced over the students and the door, constantly waiting. No one entered. "Right, we have a few minutes still till lunch," Mike said, clearly wanting something to fill in the silence in the room. He paused. "So, why don't we all introduce ourselves?" The room broke into a hum of chatter. One of the girls nearer the front raised her hand. "Why are we starting if the whole class isn't here yet? Isn't that counterproductive? We'd have to do it twice," she called without waiting to be called upon. The teacher didn't mind. "It's because waiting is boring and we've already heard Nizu spiral and I just want to meet you all," Mike explained. "We'll have to do it again though," the same girl argued. Mike made a zip hand gesture. "I had to deal with Nizu's welcoming speech 3 times today. Give me something I can look forward to. Tell me something random about yourself. Skip the name, I'll figure that out after lunch instead of doing English with you all." The purplenet groaned from his desk at that. Izuku could hear the muffled sound, but no one else could. It was probably a good thing. No one liked hard workers. They were annoying, and the only thing good for them was being a punching bag. His friend didn't need that. The bags under his eyes screamed insomnia. The ache from bruises caused by bullies would make it harder to drift off into the dreamland. "Okay then. I like dogs," she said. No one had the time to add a comment because Mike let out a high-pitched squeak. It could have broken a window if UAs weren't built to withstand constant quirk usage. "Do you have any pictures of them? I have this border collie and she's the cutest. My husband got so annoyed because he wanted a cat instead, but he has no taste in anything, let alone animals. Dogs are superior. You have to tell me all about them." Beside Izuku, a tired boy raised his head at the mention of a feline pet. "Cats are better. Your husband has the right idea," he stated. Mick's jaw dropped at the declaration. He moved away from the student's desk he had previously been at to look at the purplenet. His jaw moved up and down trying to make a noise. It didn't work for a while, which was probably for the best. If Mike was that taken by surprise over a common opinion, what came out of his mouth may have been worse. The voice hero was not known for subtlety. "That's call listener. Who are you so I can tell my husband all about you?" Cat lovers instantly get his approval, so he'll be thankful I have one in my class. Mike said when his mouth agreed to work. Shinsu Hitachi. The purplenet said. His face had flushed red at the compliment. He looked at Mike Sensei with wide eyes, waiting for him to give him the attention of the class. Shinsu's voice mustn't have traveled across the room. Can you repeat that, listener? I'm a bit deaf, you see. Mike explained. Shinsu Hitachi. He repeated. Not expecting Mike to grin as he pulled his phone out in the middle of class. That's spelled with a U at the end, right? Of Shinosu. The rest of his face may have cleared up in the small break he was granted. His ears turned a shade of pink again at the attention. He nodded. Yeah, that's right. He whispered. The odds of Mike hearing it were impossible low, but the message got across. Mike sent a thumbs up and moved to the second person at the front as if the interaction never happened. Lunch had never come quick enough. Izuku found himself tailing behind Shinsu in the correct direction. His hunger hadn't reached up, and the bento he had packed in his bag seemed too much. He didn't want to stay in the classroom though. Slipping onto the table, he opened the box and looked at the rice peeled into one of the areas. The chopsticks that had been slid under the elastic band slipped off. He held them in his hand and picked a few pieces up. He placed it in his mouth before he placed them down again. Are you going to get anything from lunch rush, Shinsu-san? Izuku asked, looking at his friend's empty space by him. Shinsu looked down where his food should have been. He looked round to see the queue for the cafeteria food and the prices. Biting down on his lip, Shinsu weighed his options together. On one hand, neither of them were starving if how Izuku was picking at his rice was any hint. Shinsu didn't need the food. Whether he wanted to stuff his face with food was a different matter. His parents hadn't given him any money, so the 10,000 yen in his pocket with all he had the day. I'm done, he said. His voice lacked any excitement, but that was better than sounding like a kicked puppy. Izuku raised an eyebrow. He didn't push for questions, instead he pushed his box. I'm not that hungry either, and Mew Mum would flip if she found I hadn't eaten all my food. Do you want to share? Just for today. Normally school work tires me out, but I think we both slept through the whole orientation. I'm not surprised neither of us are kicking it from hunger. Shinsu chuckled. Sure, let me grab my chopsticks. He dug into his bag looking for the wooden utensils. He shuffled through the folders he intended his books to be left in. Where had he put his chopsticks? Do you need any help, Shinsu-kun? Izuku asked when he saw his friend flurry around for the objects. Shinsu looked up at him and shook his head. I'm fine. I just can't find my chopsticks. They'll be in here somewhere. He deflected the help when he pulled the last of his books out. They still weren't at the bottom of his nag. Yet nothing could be seen that resembled the tools. Shinsu, do you even need them desperately? If they've been at the bottom of your bag that long, I doubt they'll be good to eat with. Izuku stated. He was counting through the folders that laid out through their table. I mean, it'd be a bummer if I have lost them. Shinsu said. He tipped the bag upside down, letting a pile of tissues, stained with blood, and slim pair of keys fall out. Izuku gulped down a rock in his throat when he saw the collection of blood. He had a collection of similar types in his bin at home. They were tucked away behind the door, from where kicking had gone a bit harsher than just burns. He didn't have enough to fill the bottom of his bag though. He stared at the collection. The chopsticks still aren't in here, Shinsu said, ignoring everything he had just pulled out. Midoriya sighed. Do you want me to go grab some by the food stalls? I'm sure Lunch Rush won't even notice. You put everything back in your bag. He made a vague hand gesture to the tissues across the table. Shinsu nodded. He started to clump the paper together. Midoriya walked towards the food station. Izuku took his time walking, trying to weave in and out of students to avoid Kiken's line of sight. With skill only learned through practice, he slid back to the now clean table. He handed the chopsticks over. You are still up to share after all this, aren't you? Izuku asked as he took another mouthful of rice. Shinsu nodded when he too had some. Only if you're okay with it? He repeated as if asking for permission. Izuku nodded and swallowed the mouthful of rice he had in his mouth. I think it's the right time we get formally acquainted. I'm Midoriya Izuku and I'm Quirkless. It was better to get it over with. He didn't need Shinsu believing a lie based off deception. Anyways, it was still day one. If Shinosu turned out to be another Kiken, Izuku could always find a new friend or tell present Mike. He didn't expect the dry laugh that came from Shinsu when he took his hand. "You have it worse than me, huh?" he joked, causing Midoriya to raise an eyebrow. "I'm Shinosu Hitoshi and I can brainwash whoever answers my questions." Chapter 6, If reporters are a usually thing, why is everyone so surprised when they storm UA? Why haven't the teachers prepared for this? Shinsu, Izuku called as he hopped up the stairs to UA. They had made a point of arriving at the school earlier than planned due to the likely media outbreak. They had been fortunate to avoid it as expected. The purplenet still didn't hear his green-haired friend as he was too far ahead. Izuku picked up his pace. "Shinsu." The friend slowed down and looked across his shoulder before smiling at Izuku. "Oh hey. I'm so glad you're ahead. My friend in the hero course messaged me about how many reporters there are. They must really want to see all the future heroes. I don't blame them at all, but the amount being sent is stir crazy. Imagine carrying that much. The sports festival's in 2 months and even I can wait that long. Do you reckon coming to UA makes you assign a form about interviews?" Izuku mumbled. His voice didn't quieten as he info dumped onto Shinsu. He trusted the boy enough that he wouldn't get mocked. Shinsu let Izuku talk. There was an eyebrow raise that went ignored. It was a tradition for UA students to be overwhelmed by the press on their second day. When Izuku imagined the bodies pressed up against him, he freaked out. The thought of having a microphone shoved in his face sent shivers down his spine. Only hero students got swarmed, but the reporters hadn't got better at spotting what set the two apart. Izuku knew he would be at a risk of being caught up, if the swarm didn't eat him before he got to the entryway. Izuku always planned on getting in early for that reason. Warning Shinsu only seemed like the correct thing to do. After all, friends had to stick together. He would have warned his whole class if he had gained their numbers. He hadn't. Shinsu looked relieved at the reveal the two had managed to miss the reporters. Even if it meant having to deal with Izuku's rambling. They weren't half bad. Shinsu could have lived without worrying that he missed an important message though. "I'm not sure." Shinsu responded to Izuku's questions. "I know my parents wouldn't have signed the form." Izuku hummed, "I guess so. My mum wouldn't have either, and I doubt the news would even care." "Yeah, what are they gonna do? Go up to us and be like, hey, do you have parental permission?" "Yes, of course they are. That is surely their biggest concern." The two snickered. The press had been a demon. Izuku hated the idea of when being a hero was still his dream. He couldn't imagine Shinsu being a fan of attention either. It put anyone who considered going underground out to the public. UA students always graduated. One article from your school days was enough to have fans before you even picked a hero name. The thought was enough to cause discomfort, yet the principal allowed it. If Izuku had to take a guess as to why, he would assume it was to get used to it all. It still had its flaws. The press arrived as soon as Shinsu and Izuku had onto the school grounds where they were same. The cameras were flashing at them from where they stood. No one dared step past the invisible line, but the sound was enough to send Izuku curling closer to Shinsu. "Holy shit, you were right," Shinsu muttered. His voice was overwhelmed by the screams of the reporters. Izuku shuffled closer towards Shinsu. "I know, I didn't think it'd be this bad." "No shit. How is anyone getting through that?" "I don't know. I have no clue. We're just going to hope a teacher comes soon." "Right, should we head to class?" Shinsu suggested. He looked over at the entrance where they had been heading. He felt as the tufts of hair on Izuku's head shuffled. The sensation left him sniffling for giggles. "Yeah," Midoriya said. He untucked himself from Shinsu's side. He felt the breeze that came from the wind. A pout formed on his face. Izuku didn't move more than arm's reach away from his friend. Shinsu didn't object or shuffle further, so Izuku took the closeness as okay. They entered the hallway where the air conditioning hit them full force. The warm air was like sipping on a hot chocolate while watching it snow, yet Izuku couldn't force himself to move. In tow, they entered the classroom. Izuku and Shinsu were the first to arrive. The others having caught their normal bus or train, causing them to become the media's field day. From the window in the classroom, the two could watch their classmates struggle. Izuku grimaced as someone who looked like Yuriko was gripped on the shoulder. It was tight enough she was held in place. Shinsu gritted his teeth at the sight. Another girl was held up. A reporter had a handful of her ginger hair in his fists. She stood there stuck between ruining her reputation before it began and her own comfort. The hair wasn't the only place she was held. Izuku had to turn away from the window. How can they be allowed to do any of that? Izuku asked to no one in particular. Heroes are just expected to suck that up. Shinsu snarked, their quirks and how sellable they are matter more now. If they want to get up the rankings and get more money, or even earn more opportunities, the media can't keep it in their pants. Izuku sniffled a snort at the last sentence. People let them get away with it though. Like, surely someone's called the tabloids out for being creeps at a bunch of teenagers. It's normalized. They're celebrities and celebrities dealt with this in the pre-quirk era. Fuck normalization then. Izuku seethed. He looked out the window to check on her. She was free and now creeping through the crowds to escape their clutches. Beside him Shinsu relaxed watching her make it past the safety line. She stopped before she vanished from their sight. When she vanished, a shaggy man dressed in black walked out. A scarf was wrapped around his neck to protect him from the remains of the winter breeze. He slouched past the safety mark and took a speaker off the closest reporter. Whatever he said from there was muffled by the glass. The two could see the affects of the words. Reporters were slinking away and the students slipped in the gaps into the line. A few brave kids showed their quirks off once uninterrupted. They were playing with fire, teasing the news with the quirks they possessed. They stopped once they left their sight. A few minutes later, Izuku's classmates crawled in. Their skin was as white as a sheet. The excitement from being in UA had been sucked away from them after one encounter with the news. No one gave a second glance to the two as they merged with their classmates. The worst of the day was over for all of their senses bar their ears. That was the only con that came from having present Mike as your homeroom teacher. No one could come out of 1C with working hearing. Midoriya-kun, may I sit with you? Yurika asked. She held her tray out instead of resting it on the table. Midoriya placed his chopsticks down and waved towards the seat opposite him. Yurika raised her eyebrows but placed her tray down. When Izuku swallowed the rice he had in his mouth he said, "You don't have to ask. There's a seat opposite me. Shinsu-kun is beside me, he's just gone to get chopsticks seeing as he forgot his again." "Oh. You've already made friends then. The hero course is a lot. Everyone's so eccentric. There are so many amazing quirks, you'd have loved it Midoriya. I talked to Tsu-chan a lot. She's got this frog quirk, which is pretty self-explanatory. There's also Itza and Mina but I'm not as close to them. 2 people already got kicked out. Our teacher," he rolled out with a sleeping bag slurping a jelly packet. "What was orientation like? You probably noticed we skipped, we had to do a quirk test and 2 kids failed. One of them had this strong spaghetti quirk as well." "Okay, that doesn't sound as strong as it was but Midoriya they could just create it from their fingertips. They weren't trying hard enough. I don't really know how they could have used it unless they propelled themselves up. This other kid actually did well but he was a complete perv. I don't want to sound bad but I'm really glad he's gone. He tried to use Yaoyorozu, who's beautiful, as a tool to get across. I don't think Aizawa-sensei would have minded." Momo was creeped out by his insistence on staying on though. The girl didn't ramble, Izuku just let her speak out from interest on what the hero course was like. Yurika took a break when she was interrupted by Shinsu Hitachi. The purple-haired boy had slid beside Izuku halfway into their conversation and had listened in. "You have Aizawa Shouta, as an Eraserhead as your homeroom Tiak Reiter?" he asked. His eyes looked filled with wonder when Yurika nodded. "I'd never heard of him before yesterday. He was an absolute badass earlier as well. You got in early but he scared all the reporters off." Shinsu raised a hand at Yurika before she could continue on what would be another spiral. "You have the Eraserhead as your homeroom teacher?" "Yeah? Is he a famous hero I hadn't heard of?" "Nah, the whole point Yurika is that you don't know who he is," Izuku whispered. "He's an underground hero because his quirk works best if you're unprepared. It's called Erasure and you'll see it sooner or later in action. One look and your quirk factor stops working. It wears off when he blinks but that's his only handicap. That scarf he wears, that makes up for his lack of an offensive quirk like yours." There was a gap before he turned to Shinsu looking betrayed by himself. "How did we not notice him from the scarf earlier? It's iconic. We're idiots," Shinsu said. Izuku rolled his eyes and flicked back to Yurika. "What's he like as a teacher other than the whole expelling people thing? Is he a good teacher?" Yurika chuckled. "We actually only have him for homeroom. He's meant to have us for hero ethics as well but we don't have that till Thursday." I mean, you'll be settled down for your most important lesson then. Izuku reckons we had the worst of the media today, meaning as long as we should keep being early, we'll be able to avoid them completely. Yurika's shoulders slumped at that news. We just had the worst of it? That's great. It was so scary. I don't think I could do another day, but I also couldn't wake up early enough to miss them. Izuku smiled while Shinsu remained with a straight face. You should get up earlier. Then you could get eye bags as Gucci as mine, he said, pointing to the black rings that dragged his eyes open. Yurika squeaked. Izuku laughed. He nudged Shinsu with his elbow, yet he was weak enough that he didn't fall off his seat. That isn't a good thing, Shinsu, he said. Are you sure? I personally think I rock the eye bag look. But each to their own, I guess. Shinsu shrugged. No. The lack of sleep, you have to earn them. They suit you, but why don't you draw them out with eyeliner or something? I think that'd be really cool and healthier. Yurika-san, please agree with me. Shinsu-kun shouldn't enjoy having eye bags. They're unhealthy. Izuku threw his hands in the air, neglecting the chopstick that was in the palm of his hand. The utensils dropped onto the table. Yurika blinked. He finally pulled his hands back down to where they were meant to be. She was making sure that actually happened. You can't draw eye bags with eyeliner, Izuku-kun. They don't work like that. If you want to have them like Shinsu-kun, you'd have to neglect your sleep. She explained. I don't even think you would want to try to see what result you could get. It'd be hilarious to see though. Izuku snorted. Fine, you can come round mine in a few days, so I can ask my mom. I need to prove to Shinsu he should at least try to sleep. It doesn't work like that, Midoriya. You don't just choose to not sleep. I mean, I don't think anyone would do that, seeing as it's a massive help and refreshing. She gets it? Shinsu joked. He pointed to Yurika and the girl laughed. She shook her head, but at the same time they both said, it's insomnia. Izuku watched the two talk in sync. He shook his head. You two cannot be in sync already. I refuse to believe it. Then you're in for an issue. You see, we have connected our minds already. Bound together by lack of sleep. Shinsu said. Yurika shoved a mouthful of rice in her mouth. It was to prevent herself from chuckling at the statement. She drew a line around her own and shook her head. Shinsu raised an eyebrow but quickly figured out what she was trying to get across. Or well, my lack of sleep. But Midoriya, we two can bond in that way. Should you join the eye bag squad and let Yurika do her magic? I'm sure her eye bag makeup tutorial that she will pull up on YouTube will surely be of top tier quality. Also because I want to see you suffer, because I'm that kind of guy. Yurika placed her chopsticks down and swallowed the rice she had in her mouth. How'd you know I have never drawn eye bags onto myself before? That is dreadfully privileged. We cannot all afford the eye bags you have. Izuku shook his head. No, Yurika, it is not a privilege. It is a sign of the battles he has fought with sleep. No one wishes to do that. Thanks for the sentiment. You're welcome. The conversation trailed off at that. There was only a few minutes left of the break and all of their bowls were still half full. Izuku picked up a piece of chicken with no intention of placing his chopsticks down again. There was no way he could finish all of the food his mom had packed for him. Izuku never got the chance to try and finish his food though. The alarm was blaring in his ear. Students were screaming at the sound. Everyone had taken to the corridors in an attempt to escape. They were leaving chairs out and available to trip over. It hadn't even been 30 seconds since the first ring when the crowd swept Izuku out from where he sat. They carried him out to sea. He was drowning in everyone's bodies. He couldn't see other the heads of his fellow classmates. The signal that had been set off was never explained. The panic of the students only increased. A jab was sent into Izuku's side and quirks activated, likely against the user's will. No one was prepared. They were wading through the sea trying to feign some sort of idea on what to do. It was fruitless, no one's voice could carry across the room. The corridor was fast approaching. Everyone was squishing and bodies were huddling closer together. Izuku's ribcage might burst any second. His cheek was squashed against a second year's arm and he could do nothing to move. His feet were frozen in the spot. His whole body was tearing apart. Izuku yanked at his leg, begging it to work. It was held in the crowd's grip and in any second it could have fallen off. Izuku didn't think anyone in UA would be unaware of it did end that way, but he wasn't willing to run the risk. With all his strength, he yanked his leg. letting it push past the bodies unknowing trapping it. The change in weight sent his falling to the fall. Izuku should have landed on another student, yet his head just missed. The floor was cold and no one could see him from below. The feet of people took up enough room for him to slip in. It was a stroke of luck, really. He pushed himself up and looked around, trying to get a look on what was happening. Those around him weren't the same as before. The heads were slightly smaller. If Izuku went in his tiptoes he could see the strands of purple in the crowds. He wanted to call for who had to be Shinsu, but the student body was still screaming. Any teachers who tried to get in and calm them would be taken by the waves. It was hopeless. The only chance Izuku had at not being squawked to death was to slip to the back. It couldn't hinder him too much, no one getting out at the current rate. Midoriya flipped round. Like swimming against a tide, he pushed past the bodies. People were yelling at him, trying to get him to work with them. Izuku ignored them. He wanted to box his EAS to avoid the critics. His arms weren't essential to keeping his balance. Most of these kids were supposed to be future heroes, yet they were acting like civilians. It really didn't help soothe Izuku's nerves. He would have expected one person to realize he was scared and not of whatever was inside the building. Were the hero course students really so self-centered? There was always the chance he was surrounded by fellow general education students. One person must have thought of someone else. He slipped down against the walls. The further back he got, the less people he bumped into. Soon enough, he could slink his way past the crowds. He couldn't see his hands without risking being knocked over. He felt them dip into a classroom. He pulled himself into the empty 1D classroom. Izuku had no hesitance to shut the door. Now that the students' screams weren't a constant, he let himself stagger against a wall. His balance must have been thrown off from the event. Keeping himself up was an effort. The bell wasn't ringing anymore, which was a win. He couldn't remember if that meant the issue had been solved. It didn't matter. The damage from panic had been greater considering no villain had been spotted. Izuku pulled out the chair beside him and sat in it. He curled around himself and went over the facts he had. Right now, Izuku was alone in 1D's homeroom. In the middle of a mass panic that could rival one that came from villain attacks. The alarms had stopped, meaning the villain had likely been stopped. Shinsu and Yurika were in the crowd. Izuku couldn't leave the safety of the classroom without compromising his own safety yet. Lunch had ended 10 minutes ago. He had been squashed for 20 minutes, it had felt shorter. Izuku was glad about that though. If that felt like 5 minutes, he dreaded what 20 minutes would feel like. The teachers would be on their way to fix it now. There wasn't a pro chilling and enjoying their lunch in 1D right now. They must have realized on their way to classes. It was another 5 minutes before the catastrophe was dealt with. The first person to look into 1D saw him and Izuku saw him. That simple interaction was enough for Izuku to grab his bag and rush to the room next door. 1C would be close, then he could apologize to Mike Sensei for being late. The rest of the lesson could be spent talking to Shinsu in an attempt to calm his nerves. That plan was thrown out the window when he was in the class with no sign of Shinsu. Any student in the hallways had been escorted to their lessons. Mike confirmed that at the start, meaning Shinsu hadn't been in the corridors. Izuku watched the door for a few seconds before he raised his hands. Mike Sensei, can I go check on Shinsu-kun? Or has he been take off sick? Present Mike looked up to see the missing desk. He bent down to scroll through his computer before he nodded. You have 10 minutes, I'll go tell the teachers we've missed a kid. Don't waste this time, Midoriya. Midoriya was already on the stairs to get to the door. He swung it open and nodded. I'll do my best, he stated. The corridors were quiet, so different to how it was earlier. Izuku wandered down, retracing his steps. He went through what he would have done personally. The first place Izuku would have headed was the cafeteria. He hadn't seen Shinsu take his bag down with Bim, but that was still an option. The door is locked, Shinsu couldn't have gone there, or he was a very good hider. For his own sake, Izuku went for the former. He continued on checking in with the empty classrooms. There wasn't a shred of purple hair in the backgrounds. Just empty classrooms. He pulled out his phone and sent a text. Midoriya. Hey Yurika, were you with Shinsu when he the crowds? I can't find him. Yurika. I was. I lost him around halfway through. I think he hid in one of the rooms. Have you checked the bathrooms? No, Izuku hadn't, and that would be the best place to start. He pushed the bathroom door open. One of the stalls were shut. Izuku sighed and knocked on it. Hey, I'm looking for a Shinsu, purple sticky up here, and I just need to know if you've seen him or if that is you in here, he said while pressing his ear up against the door. If he hadn't done so, he could have missed the chuckle that came out in response. It was wet and strangled like you might be if you laughed when the world fell down around you. The guy in the stall didn't give him a verbal answer. It was understandable. Izuku would laugh if that was what someone said to him while he was crying in the bathroom. Look, he continued, can you tell me if you've seen him, then I'll leave you in peace. Please, I am a few seconds away from having Mike Sensei look for me as well because I left English to look for him. If you haven't seen him, just ignore me. I'll give you a few minutes so you can settle down. Izuku leaned on the pillar beside the stall and waited. His hands fumbled around to resist the temptation to knock. There was a shuffling of feet and Izuku's hand almost went back to the door. There wasn't the whirl of the plumbing doing its work. The door clicked open as the lock went undone. Izuku looked at where the boy was standing. He had fluffy purple hair that stood up because gravity didn't affect it. His eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot, tear tracks ran down his cheeks. They had been smudged in a haste. The kid gave a forced smile that passed better as a smirk. Shinsu, you were in there? Izuku stammered. Shinsu brushed his hands through his hands. Fingers curled around the edges and pulling gently. It was enough to send a pain to ground him but avoided any strands laying stray across the bathroom floor. Well, you found me. He shrugged. Are you okay? Izuku pointed to his cheeks and poked it. You've been crying. The tears started up again as Shinsu gave a weak laugh. He wiped them away with his wrist and nodded. Yeah, I noticed. Midoriya nodded and pulled some loo roll out of the stall beside him and handed it over. Shinsu took it and blew his nose. The process repeated twice before he stopped and wiped his tears away instead. They had settled for position so Izuku didn't have to stretch far to reach the loo roll. Shuffling had been unconscious, yet Shinsu was now leaning where Izuku had been. Midoriya was on the paper-thin corner. Class was closer to ending than starting and a teacher was yet to find them. You want to talk about it? Izuku asked. Shinosu shrugged and huffed. You mind doing it after class? I don't think we have much of class left, but if it's more about not doing it on this manky floor, I don't blame you. I'm sure my mum wouldn't mind you coming round. The problem wasn't the floor but more along the lines I needed the time, but this floor is mank. Izuku laughed. His legs gave up as he collapsed on the floor. Above him, Shinsu snorted at him. They kept muttering mank and I'm the mank floor. Anytime one of them vaguely calmed down from the laughing fit, the other would set them off again. After a while, Izuku finally pulled himself together and looked up at Shinsu. Are we bunking off class and sticking in here then? Shinsu nodded. That sounds like a plan. Alright, that's where we'll leave off for the day. Thanks so much for listening along with me today. If you enjoyed, please like and comment down below. It really helps with the algorithms. I look forward to seeing you next time. Ciao for now, lovelies.